Great to be with you all tonight, in the ether, as we've got so used to being. And ironically, here we are tonight meeting online to talk about an artifact of the pre-digital age, the book, specifically the illustrated architecture book, which I'm sure many of us in this gathering tonight possess, a fair number of, but probably none of us reach the level of John Hill, who's an architect and a writer who absolutely loves illustrated architecture books, so much so that he has made a book about them. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. The book is called Buildings in Print, 100 Influential and Inspiring Illustrated Architectural Books. There's a number of I's there, which maybe he'll explain to us. It's a survey of 100 seminal architecture manifestos, monographs, exhibitions, theories, and histories that in his view have profoundly influenced the paths taken by 20th century architecture. It opens with Le Corbusier's 1923 Vers une Architecture, or Towards a New Architecture. It ends with Reinier de Graaf's 2017 Four Walls and a Roof, and the book raises all sorts of fascinating questions about the books that have shaped architecture. So I'm going to be asking John a few questions about it immediately following his presentation. But before we go to that, I want to hear actually very briefly from the two people who've really brought together this event tonight. That is David Kennedy, architect and past chair of the Interior Architecture Committee at AIALA, and Cello Montoya, Assistant Vice President of Adult Education and Public Programs at Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Welcome to you both. This talk tonight is your brainchild. You two agreed that this book about architecture books warranted a talk and some public attention. I'm intrigued as to why. So I certainly think it does, but I want to hear why you do. So let's kick off with you, David. You are manifesting by the place you are sitting that you love books. So so tell us what attracted you to this one.
Thank you, Frances, and thank you, John, for accepting the Interior Architecture Committee's invitation to present. 6 years ago, when my daughter graduated from high school, I decided to fill my newfound time reconnecting with architectural literature. Already loving old architecture or old hardcover books from reading fiction, I started by replacing my paperbacks from school and career with used hardcover editions found in bookstores in Portland and LA and during travels to other cities. It was when I was looking for a list of bookstores in New York City that I discovered John's blog dedicated to reviewing new and sometimes old architectural books. Not only did it have this bookstore list, which led to some nice finds in New York, it also had given me an expanded knowledge of architectural writing and the works that inspire it. His new book is at once a nice condensation of this blog and a colorful user guide to an architectural library. It's prompted me to re-examine books on my shelves with a new view to what I might extract from them. And then also it's added to my list of books yet to procure. So I'm excited to hear John's story in writing Buildings in Print.
Great. And it's definitely a selective list. So there's a method, there's an underlying idea here that he has. So Cello, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to say thank you so much for the introduction, Francis, and also to the American Institute of Architects, Los Angeles. This is such a thoughtful program, and I'm so happy to see so many people on Zoom meeting because we want to be in touch, and the webinars just don't give us this interaction. Thank you for being here. And also I want to share that this is part of a long history with LACMA and AIA Los Angeles. We've partnered on a lecture series involving many distinguished visionary architects, such as John and the work that you're expanding upon of other architects in our field. And we're just so fortunate to present this. A little backstory, we've actually been in contact and conversation with AIA for since the beginning of the pandemic on what's our next program going to be? And it took all of his time to finally get to this program. And I think it's the perfect reentry. Really encyclopedic in nature, like LACMA is an encyclopedic museum representing all cultures, all centuries, all mediums. And architecture is as a fond medium of our audiences. And we're so grateful to bring both of our audiences together, to cross-pollinate, to be reintroduced to so many other architects, leaving breadcrumbs to new books we can open. So we're grateful for your work, John, and I can't wait to hear more about your methodology. I'm also grateful for the Peter Zumthor spread to open that, and also, you know, he's the named architect of the new building that LACMA's developing right now on the east side of campus. We're excited about that chapter of our museum, and that it's a unique building that will be one level, you know, all in one plane for an encyclopedic museum, which, you know, already has a hierarchy embedded. So it was lovely to see that, and to learn so many more architects that I can add to my wish list of books. I adore your collection and can't wait to see what you want to share tonight. Thank you for having LACMA, and yeah, thank you.
Well, there you go, John. You have the perfect segue. It's over to you. John's going to give a presentation, and following that, it'll last around 30 minutes. And then after that, I'll do a brief Q&A with John, and then we open the floor to questions, as Corinne explained. So, John, tell us about buildings in print and why they're inspiring, influential, and important. Illustrated, I should say.
All right, great. Thank you, Francis, and thank you to David in particular for the invitation to come talk. And thanks to AIALA and LACMA as well, especially the Interior Architecture Committee at AIALA. And like Francis said, I'll be giving a visual presentation about a half hour before we do our chat. So moving forward, well, just want to say that kind of very, very quick background on how the book happened. It was directly influenced or inspired by a book by a graphic designer named Jason Godfrey. He did a book in 2009 called Bibliographic, in which he had 100 books on graphic design that were kind of notable in that field, but also visually kind of beautiful books, and just presented them with short descriptions, with photographs of the covers and the spreads. And you know, I bought the book and look at it every now and then, and I always figured there was probably an architecture book in the same vein that already existed. But after I did a few books, this Buildings in Print is my 7th book, did a few books with Prestel, and was going to meet with my editor to see what do we do next. You know, I figured that, like I said, this book existed, but I realized doing a little research that it didn't. So started to kind of toy around with doing an architecture version of that book, and Prestel was interested, so just went from there. But the process was pretty speedy. It was between October 2019 and April 2020, end of April 2020, that I worked on the book. So I can't say that I wasn't preparing for it in other ways, through my blog and through just kind of the many, many years of acquiring books and reading books and reviewing them. So, you know, it kind of was just doing a lot of work to research, to write, to get some of these important books that I didn't already have, and also to photograph them. And let's see. Sorry, skip that. So I was not planning on photographing these books when I started with the idea of Buildings in Print, and actually was going to use part of my advance to hire a photographer who would then just photograph all of them, and I would take care of the research and the writing. But kind of logistical reasons, that didn't really work out, because there were questions like, where would they be photographed? How would we get 100 books back and forth from that? Do I write about the books before knowing what the photographs are, or are they photographed first and then I'm stuck kind of doing captions for pages that I no longer felt were as relevant? So it ended up, and especially with the pandemic and kind of spending 2 months during lockdown on the final stretch of the book, it worked out kind of well to be working at home and just kind of writing. And I would kind of write in the morning and then photograph when the light was good, let's say. So if, this is actually how our dining area, live with my wife and daughter in Astoria, Queens, and have this east-facing window in the dining room. So when the morning sun was good on the weekends or when, what have you, would have this set up and ready to go and just kind of get the book down, flatten it with glass so that the could actually photograph it well, and but had to do things like the reflections of the red brick wall on the neighbor's building would actually cast a red glow on the book. So I had to correct that in Photoshop. And I won't get into too much more detail, but it was quite a learning experience to be doing all that. But in terms of the selection, it was one that started very open-ended. It started with Vitruvius and went through to Palladio and Alberti and so on, all these kind of early manifestos, if you will, or treatises on architecture. And these are ones that you learn about in architecture school and history classes, but I didn't feel that those were necessarily ones that architects used too much on I don't want to say on a daily basis, but they weren't that important. So I went to the kind of jump to the realization pretty quickly of just starting with Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture, which Francis has said was published in French. There's an Architecture in 1923, translated 4 years later as Towards a New Architecture. And then just kind of going from there to the present. And it very much was in line with a couple books that I did with Prestel that had this structure of 100 years and either 100 buildings or 100 landscapes. And the idea with those books was you did one building, say, per year, based on completion date or opening date. And it was kind of this strict experiment, if you will, to kind of just trace mainly modern architecture from, in that case, it was, I think, 1917 to 2016. And I think the last building in that book was the Broad in downtown LA. But it was, instead of kind of having these clusters, say, of buildings when you had boom times or ignoring the lulls with wars and depressions, it was kind of forcing this. So with the books, I didn't want to do something that strict, but I started the spreadsheet with this kind of year by year layout that I had been doing. And so if anything, the spreadsheet maybe shows how my collection, what years, because the light green are books that are in my library, dark green are the ones that made the cut into Buildings in Print. The other ones are ones I was considering, but it kind of does show a little bit of the peaks and valleys, turned on its side here, of architectural publishing. And so in terms of format, so I wanted to structure it thematically rather than just strictly chronologically with those 100 books. So the idea was to have these chapters that within each chapter, there's then a chronological sequence. So you could see with histories or education, for instance, you would kind of get an idea of how books on those topics evolved from, say, 1920s or 30s to near the present. The only exceptions to that are the first and the last chapters. And the idea, at least with manifestos, is that kind of the, arguably it can be said that Delirious New York by Rem Koolhaas was kind of a symbol or a signal of the death of the manifesto, because it wasn't towards a new architecture, a forward-looking thing. It was like looking backwards. It was looking to, to New York with a 19th century grid, but no plan for how to fill it. So it was kind of looking back and finding a manifesto for that. So that first chapter goes to the 78 when that was published. And then the last chapter kind of resumes from there when, in my opinion, at least, instead of manifestos, you have more critiques of modern architecture, and then also some theories of what architecture can be. So with that, this talk will just kind of run through the book in order. I'm not going to talk about every book that's in it, obviously, but I'm going to stop here and there and highlight a few of them. But I will go at least through chapter by chapter to show, well, what are those kind of first and last books within there. And I do want to point out that the book, beautifully designed, I think, is by Barbara Glauber. She gave this kind of color format that you could see in the table of contents, and then that carries through into the chapters. Each one starts with a 2-page spread with one of the books that follows. In this case, it's a spread on Corbusier's Ronchamp in a book by Charles Jenks. And like it's been said a few times now, this book chapter on manifestos and the book itself then starts with Corbusier's famous manifesto that pretty much every architect has learned about, if not read. The one that I ended up using in my book is from the Getty translation, and it's just simply called Toward an Architecture. Supposedly a more proper translation from the French and Towards a New Architecture. But one of the reasons that Corbusier's book jumped out to me to kind of start this book and to be the kind of the oldest one within is that although he did not invent, let's say, the visual language for architects to do these polemics of modern architecture, he certainly popularized it with architects, and a lot of architects after him did similar things in the case of juxtaposing images for effect, really taking control of how books were, the pages and the spreads were laid out, and also just the selection of images. So again, that starts the book, and the other manifestos in this chapter include Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction Architecture, which was written in '62. It did not get published until '66, and that was by MoMA. It's kind of ironic that the Museum of Modern Art, who did the Modern Architecture exhibition in 1932, was basically commissioning somebody to dismantle modernism. But there were two books, or not two books, two versions, two editions. The smaller cover is the original put out by MoMA and the Graham Foundation. And Peter Blake, in a review, and I think it was Architectural Forum, complained about the kind of stamp size images, that you can see those in that column beside the text. So a second edition in a landscape format was put out about 5 years, or I think it was a decade later, actually. But you can see those same images are on the bottom of the screen, the Guild House in Philadelphia by Venturi. And then another book by Venturi, this time with Denise Scott Brown and Stephen Eisenhower, that also had two editions, is Learning from Las Vegas, which when I was in undergraduate architecture school in the early 90s, I had the small version that was put out in 1977, not the large hardcover from 1972, and probably never would have gotten it except some I guess a librarian who didn't maybe know, or a student at a library who didn't know what they were doing, put it in the discard pile at a library. And I got it for $10, one of the best days of my life when it comes to architecture books. But anyways, you could see the larger pages here. Predominantly, you can see a small version or a smaller page where it says I am a monument. But anyways, the Muriel Cooper from MIT Press did the layout for that. And this book famously had the duck and the decorated shed, you know, kind of looking at how architecture is you know, a form expressing itself, or is it some other communicative aspect like signage in front of a box. And they saw Muriel Cooper's design as more of a duck, and also one that was not really affordable to students. So they came out with that second edition some years later. But the book I want to kind of spend a little bit more time in the manifestos chapter is Charles Jenks's The Language of Postmodern Architecture. That was, it's not the last book in the chapter, that again is Delirious New York. But it came out 1 year previous to that. It's actually gone through, I think it did 6 editions. After the first edition that came out in '77, my copy is for the 4th edition. The last is 2002, called The Paradigm of Architecture, the New Paradigm in Architecture, excuse me. And anyway, so you have Jenks kind of defining postmodernism in architecture, looking at metaphors, double coding, and other communicative aspects of architectural expression. And the most famous illustration, at least, that he made for the book is the Evolutionary Tree, which in that book focused on those years, kind of a postmodernism, but those trees, if you will, were done repeatedly, you know, after that in other forms. This is one that he did for Architectural Review in 2000. But you can see it's looking at the whole 20th century, not just looking at postmodern architecture. And this is actually one I scanned out of the magazine. And one thing I love that Charles Jenks did, in the bottom right corner, he indicated no copyright. He wanted this to kind of be freely available. But this was not his first book. I believe it was his 5th book, but it's the one that kind of you know, defined him as a critic and set the course for a lot of what he would be doing for the rest of his career as a critic. And here I want to point out on this spread from the book that the Evolutionary Tree is fairly well known, but the most famous part of this book is the way he kind of supposedly located the exact place and time of modern architecture's demise with the demolition of Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. I think he says it's July 15th, 1972, even has a specific date or time and or whereabouts, he says. This kind of image, there are certain images that I would see every now and then in kind of books on modern architecture. And this one of Pruitt-Igoe is one of them. And this is just an aside. It's not in my book, but kind of an LA aside of Jenks just 1 year later doing this book, Daydream Houses of Los Angeles. And even though the houses tend to be kind of vernacular kitsch, if you will, he's kind of still looking at you know, capital A architecture, and he's talking about this one on the right as he describes it as Ron Schump ski jump with mushroom overtones. So the second chapter, Histories, it starts with, not with Siegfried Gideon here, it starts with Nicholas Pevsner, and then jumps into Space-Time and Architecture by Gideon, published in 1941. Just showing it here because I think, like Corbusier, he's doing juxtaposition of images for effect, such as a painting by Picasso opposite a photograph of the Bauhaus. And at the end of that chapter is a book I really enjoyed reading, X-Ray Architecture by Beatriz Colomina, in which she kind of looks at buildings by Alto, Mies, and so on, that kind of designed almost as cures for TB and other ailments a century ago, before there were, before they kind of knew how these diseases were passed and had treatments for them. Next chapter is education, which I treat fairly broadly. Pedagogy, proportion, technology, representation, and so on. And if you're writing a book about books, about art, a book about architecture books in the 20th century or up to the present, you cannot get away from Le Corbusier, no matter how hard you try. So within this chapter is the Modular, and I can't say that too many people used it, but I think most architects know about it. It's kind of this standardized system for measurements based on the human body, and you might ask which human body, and he actually spells out it's a 6 foot tall, good-looking men that were found in English detective novels. Earlier it was a Frenchman, but they were too short for him. But then we jump forward to 2019, and this book by Moss Architects, Michael Meredith and Hilary Sample, and that's at the end of the chapter, and it's kind of shows some progress in terms of finding more diversity in figures, even though this book traces almost millennia in terms of architectural representation. It kind of pulls figures from drawings, 1,000 or more of them to be exact. But you can see here, including their own figures on the left, they have somebody in a wheelchair and people of color. So it's certainly not, Corbusier is in there, but there's a lot more to the book than just him. But and I do want to show here that there are throughout the book these top 10 lists that I asked architects, educators, critics, and others to submit. The ones that did, I was hoping to discover books that I didn't know about, or ones that I did but didn't maybe give as much importance to. And those are then laid out by the designer on these spreads, where the pages that I photographed are larger, which is nice to get some of those throughout the book. In this case, there's Eric Howler and Mei-Jin Yoon from Howler and Yoon. And so I put, or Barbara, I should say, the designer, put their list next to this drawing that extracts the Obama family from one of their projects. The next chapter, Houses and Housing, is the only one that is actually a building type of the chapters. This is not the first one in there, but an early one is Francis York's The Modern House. And this is probably the only survey in the whole book. I tried to kind of avoid architectural surveys, but when it came to a chapter with typology, included that one. And following it in order in the book is Esther McCoy's, here it's case study houses, but the first edition is Modern California Houses. And that was done the year that John Intenza, the founder of Arts and Architecture magazine, that was the year he sold the magazine. And that was kind of the year that the case study houses program that he had started in 1945, the year that I don't think it ended exactly that year, but it started to. So this one collects about 30 built and unbuilt projects that were designed for that program. Famous ones like the Stahl House at top, case study house number 22, and one that was Pierre Koenig, obviously, and one at the bottom that seemed to be one of McCoy's favorites from the way she described it in the book. And one I actually find really appealing is the Greenbelt house by Ralph Rapson, designed in the first year, but never built. And the book had a second edition in 1977 because Hennessy and Ingalls noticed that even that first edition in the early 70s was really hard to come by. So they put out a paperback edition. And, you know, the most famous probably of the case study houses is number 8 by Charles and Ray Eames. It's only attributed to Charles in the magazine and in the book. In terms of it being in the magazine, it was documented in as a completed house in December 1949. And you could see it located next to case study house number 9. That was done by Eames with Eero Saarinen. And in that issue of Arts and Architecture, it's given, I think, 14 pages. It's a lot more information than what you get in McCoy's book. And with the case study houses kind of being this enduring, there's this enduring appeal to the houses that were designed. There's been a lot more scholarship, a lot more books with extensive documentation of the houses. So, you know, I wanted to include McCoy's book, which is beautifully written, but also kind of the official document on the case study houses. But a lot of these, including blueprints for modern living, that was an exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in '89 and '90. But these more recent Taschen books, they seem to be the more familiar to people, contemporary book buyers on the case study houses. And the last book in that chapter is, to me, one of the most kind of inventive books in the last decade or so, is Atlas of Another America by Keith Crumweed in 2017, an architectural fiction in which he kind of puts together these cookie cutter houses by Toll Brothers and other builders into these communal settlements. And it's very satirical, but just kind of an amazing book. Next chapter is Monographs. There's 2 chapters on the Monographs. I like to call them the most lasting form of or type of architecture book, because they survive lulls, they survive calls for their demise. They're very expensive to produce, but they have obviously are used to promote and market architects. This photograph at the beginning of that chapter is from a monograph on Eero Saarinen that Aileen Saarinen produced after Saarinen died unexpectedly. So again, Corbusier, you can't get away from him if you're dealing with architecture books. So obviously influential as complete works, 8 volumes from 29 to 70, the last one done after his death. You have Norman Foster, Renzo Piano, Richard Meyer, other architects that kind of followed in his footsteps with that kind of format of chronological multi-volume books. Maybe more influential to architects today is small, medium, large, extra large. I probably don't need to say too much about that. Birthed a lot of heavy books, monographs, and others, but also gave kind of architects, especially ones more rooted in academia and so on, to use monographs also to stake positions, to include theories, and even little, say, mini manifestos within their books, not just present projects. And the chapter ends with Archigram, more of a retrospective than new one, because it looks at Archigram's output from 64 to 74. This chapter is also one that has the Peter Zumthor monograph. So the other monograph chapter is on case studies or buildings, which I think the book could have had various thematic chapters, and there maybe are ones that are more pressing now than might have seemed even just a few years ago. But you know, and I could even think with the idea of this book, looking at modern architecture over roughly 100 years, that things like photography, you know, experimental or utopian architecture, technology, and looking more towards the present at things like computers and sustainability. But for me, case studies are some of the most valuable books because they, you know, a building takes so much work, takes so much time, so many people involved. So to just talk about it in a few pages seems a disservice. So to devote a whole book to individual buildings, especially notable ones, I think is important. Chapter starts again with Corbusier and a book he did on Ronchamp. And it ends with the latest book, a series of monographs put out by the University of Texas at Austin. These are called the O'Neill Ford monograph series. This is number 7. And so it's devoted to E 1027 by Eileen Gray and never remember his name, Jean Badovici. The name is of the building is a cipher for their names, E for Eileen, 10 for J, and Jean, 2 for B, and Badovici, and G for Gray. So kind of Eileen Gray upholding Badovici. But it's a book that is extremely thorough in its presentation of the period drawings, period photographs, but also contemporary drawings, contemporary detailing. It's very much about the preservation of the house, as this book was done before the recent restoration, and I think played some part in that. Here you can see the Transat chair original sketches. These follow some essays, including ones by Peter Adam, who was Gray's official biographer. And you have drawings like these plans comparing the as-built versus the design as intended. You have, again, these very detailed drawings that make up maybe a third of the book. This one, there were about 100 pieces at the house that Gray designed for her and Badovici. Some of them that entered mass production, like the Transat chair and the famous side table. This one, it seemed good in a book about books to show it as the rotating bedside reading table. So you have photograph of it and some isometric drawings of it, and these extremely detailed drawings, multiple of them for each of the 20 pieces of furniture. And they were detailed enough, maybe they were detailed because of this, was they built recreations at University of Texas of Austin, UTA, to do an exhibition of some of those works from the house. The thing with that book is a lot of the line weights in the book are so small, so fine, that especially in my book where the spreads are scaled down, you lose a lot. And this book that came out close to when I was finishing my book and too late for me to include it, is on an exhibition that was at the Bard Graduate Center. It opened in February 2020, but then soon after was closed down for lockdown and reopened for about 3 weeks in the summer. And that's when I saw it and got my hands on this book. But it was beautifully designed by Irma Boom, she even put these rectangles, interlocking rectangles on the edge of the pages. So it creates a very three-dimensional object. Those interlocking rectangles continue inside the way the text, the captions, the images are treated, kind of like a rug or something that Gray designed. And it's a much more expansive book as it treats all, say, 8 decades of her life where she was designing and basically working toward more and more buildings, but realized very few. And most people just think of her architecturally as for the house E1027, but the author, the editors and curators wanted to kind of elevate her standing in terms of architecture. And one thing I find really appealing with this book, and I think I would have put it in my book given different timing, is a lot of her furniture was kinetic. And if you see the exhibition, you see it statically. Certainly can't go touch these pieces. So Boom, with the photographs and so on, did a very good job of showing the kinetic nature. And the chapter I would have put it in was exhibitions, which starts with the International Style, one of 2 books put out with the Modern Architecture exhibition in 1932. And that chapter ends with Elements of Architecture, Rem Koolhaas. And if there's an architect after Corbusier who you can't get away from in terms of books, it's Rem Koolhaas, because he's kind of latched on to books in terms of not just the power that they might hold for architects to convey information or what have you, but also just as projects in and of their own right, where they're a part of the office. They're kind of constantly being produced. They're not an afterthought. But this is another one that was designed by Irma Boom, who seems to specialize in books that contain insane amounts of information and somehow end up being legible, being kind of working in some sort of structure that you can navigate and find information. So the chapter that has more books compared to the rest is chapter 8, Building Cities, in which you have architects kind of taking on planning, infrastructure, and so forth, all the way again from Corbusier, The City of Tomorrow and Its Planning, which was first in French. I believe that was in I have to look at my notes, I think it was in 1925 in French, and then 4 years later translated into English. Almost as influential as Towards a New Architecture, at least on architects. I think some might say was too influential in terms of urban planning, because it's kind of, a lot of people attribute that it provided the template for the raising of neighborhoods in the middle of last century to create these towers in a park, mid and high rise housing projects. And the chapter moves on to, there's a book by Joseph Louis Sert on SIAM, on the International Congresses for Modern Architecture, that has more information, if you will, on that kind of top-down urbanism espoused by Corbusier, because it looks at the Athens Charter from 1933. But the book that Sert did was the official book for that, for those proceedings. But then as you go through my book, you see that architects kind of looked at the opposite. They looked at how people actually live in cities, as in Life Between Buildings by Jan Gehl from Copenhagen. That book was put out in 1971. And at that time, Reinier Banham was teaching in Southern California and working on a book about architecture and urban landscape of Los Angeles. I shared with this audience, this is a book that everybody knows and perhaps everybody has read. and it's one I read in college, and I think at the time I got a version of the first edition with the cover, the David Hockney bigger splash, which to me now it certainly conveys a leisurely lifestyle that you can have in Southern California, but also the private nature of architecture in the city. Then the latest edition of the book came out in 2009. You see the highways instead, and that is one of the 4 ecologies treated by Banham. He called it Autopia, and but ironically, he commuted by bike, folding bike, all his life. Here pictured on Dry Lake, and that was photographed for scenes in American Deserta. But he is quoted kind of famously that like English intellectuals who taught themselves Italian in order to read Dante in the original, he wrote, he learned to drive in order to read Los Angeles in the original. And 1 year after the book came out, so the book was 71, and in 1972 was this BBC documentary, Reinier Banham Loves Los Angeles, and structured from memory, from what I remember, that he drives around the city. That's kind of the way you navigate with him, but he's using the 8-track Beta car, play on the Bedecker guides at the time. And in terms of guides, it's interesting that Banham starts Los Angeles book with a mention of a guide to architecture in Southern California by David Gebhard and Robert Winter, which is actually put out by LACMA in 1965. He commends the book, but he mentions it in order to point out what his book is not. So it's not all capital A architecture. And as such, it's more inclusive than a typical guide. It has pop roadside architecture, as in here, has probably his favorite construction in the city. He calls it the most triumphant moment ever to the art of doing your thing. And this is obviously Simon Rodia's Watts Towers. And another one of the ecologies is the plains of Id, and they're obviously not ecological, but they give him a structure, a way to situate buildings into a larger context. But there were reviews at the time that called him out for ignoring many other contexts, social context, political, environmental. And it seems kind of what rises to the top with him is sustained optimism. But I like to think of the book as one that could only be written by a foreigner bringing a fresh take to the place. And these are a couple later publications that are not as famous, but kind of indicate to me the appeal that LA holds for outsiders, particularly people from the UK. And the chapter ends with a book by Interborough, a group of architects, called The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion. And it kind of documents these different parts of cities that are designed to either limit or foster what people can and can't do in public spaces. And finally, the last chapter, like I said, kind of picking up from the post-Delirious New York time it starts with actually a Christian Norbert Schultz book, Genius Loci, from 1979, but then goes into Tom Wolfe's From Bauhaus to Our House, which was put out in 1981. This is the first edition with him on the back cover. And like I said early in the talk, this image of Pruitt-Igoe kind of pops up occasionally in books on architecture. And for Wolfe, it's more celebrated, if you will, than with Jenks. But here, for Wolff, Corbusier was the enemy, Venturi was the hero, and Philip Johnson's AT&T building was kind of the culmination of the ideas that Venturi was writing about. But that book was an outsider in terms of architecture in a fairly public forum, because a lot of the book was serialized in Harper's. But this is the opposite of that. This is architects speaking to other architects in a VIP event. It was held, the Charlottesville tapes is a transcript of that. It was held in 1982, November, organized by Peter Eisenman and a few other architects. And it was originally going to be at the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, but moved to Virginia. And they couldn't talk about it beforehand. And basically the format of it was 25 architects, all men, most of them white Americans and Europeans, would present one project, and then the other architects would kind of rip it apart, something that no doubt architects are familiar with who've gone through architecture school. So this was Johnson and Philip Johnson and John Burgee presenting at the start of this this conference. And one of I don't want to say a highlight, but one of the interesting aspects of the book was Jacqueline Robertson, who organized the event with Peter Eisenman, kind of criticized how there was no public spaces, no public buildings in what the American architects were presenting. It was all very private, commercial buildings. And so he commended the Cesar Pelli unbuilt project for New Orleans in 1984 as a truly public project, although the public nature of it is an observatory at the top of the building. And then finally, this is the last book in that chapter, and then therefore the last in the whole book, Four Walls and a Roof by Reinier de Graaf from OMA. And so in this one, I kind of liked the way it draws a kind of a circle with Corbusier, in the sense that Corbusier's book started from L'Esprit Nouveau, the magazine, pulling articles from that. And half of the 44 essays in Four Walls and a Roof were taken from the Zine, Architectural Review, other print and online publications. The cover is actually a house in Germany that was built from precast concrete panels dismantled from Cold War era housing. He wrote, the panels proved intrinsically tougher than the political system that begat them. And this is the essay that led to the publication of Four Walls and a Roof, The Century That Never Happened, his take on Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, published in 2013. And it's prefaced by an image of Corbusier's Maison Domino from 1914. And then at the kind of end of that essay is a contemporary version, if you will, of it, a frame, an empty frame in Iran that seems to be waiting for completion or waiting for an infusion of capital. Then you can see on the right page that a photo essay is coming, and that is actually where most of, or about half of the illustrations in the book are found, and those are page after page, 30 pages in all, of demolitions of social housing projects, from Pruitt-Igoe to one in Neubrandenburg, Germany, and in which, it's not a celebration like Wolff or kind of a theoretical marking of modernism, postmodernism with Jenks. It's more of, it's kind of lamenting that the 20th century is being forgotten, that the social ideals are being forgotten, and that the political will to actually do something about these crises that continue is not there. And I'll say that on this last slide that with the book, a lot of things, the book, I don't want to say it wrote itself, but things kind of happened as I was writing it, I was researching and so on, that just, seemed to happen. And with this talk, I didn't mean to end on such a maybe dour note with demolitions and so on, but that's kind of the way it happened. So thank you.
Oh, well, let's see. Hello, John, again,
Yeah.
and to all of you out there. But it's a completely fascinating book, John, and I think as one who's read most of it, I can share with the audience that it's exceedingly clearly written, and I think that you really do you offer up summaries of each of the books that really help all of us that might not have the time or the desire to work our way through all the tomes. You really do explain kind of the kernel of the idea and why these books matter. Now, you obviously still are making some very personal choices. And what's intriguing to me is as much what you left out of your selection as what you chose to include. And I guess I'm going to ask you a few questions, and some of them will kind of pertain to that sort of theme. And then I urge people in the audience to start, typing up their questions and we'll go to some audience members. But let's start with something that you said right at the top, which was you said you cannot get away from Le Corbusier, however hard you try. Le Corbusier pops up over and over again. There are other very influential architects who don't make a showing at all. One of them being our local our boy, Frank Gehry. He barely gets a look in, and yet he too, in his way, has been exceedingly influential. So is the message that comes through here that you have to write manifestos to be influential? You have to actually do a book to have some influence? Or have you made a certain choice about the kind of architecture that you want to, I guess, sort of tease out through your choice of books?
Well, before answering, I should probably point out some of the factors that went into my selection that I didn't mention. One of those was to have books that were authored by, not necessarily by the architect, but they were not, say, edited collections or readers or periodicals or things like that. So they were books that were written by one or more authors as cohesive book statements, if you will. And let's see, I'm trying to remember other criteria, because when I think about what didn't end up in the book, and if the book would have gone in a different direction, it seems like some criteria that I established for myself, kind of these self-imposed criteria, as just how to figure things out from all the books that are published, all the ones that are, say, worth looking at. That would be the place to start, is like changing those criteria. Let's say specifically in terms of, Corbusier is one you can't get away from because he wrote 50 odd books in his life. And for him, books were a part of his practice. And hence kind of saying that Rem Koolhaas is kind of the contemporary version of that, or younger still is, say, Moss Architects is another firm comes to mind. The husband and wife, Meredith and Sample, they've put out a children's book. They've put out books, the unfinished encyclopedia and so on. They've have a new one on documenting vacant storefronts in New York City during the pandemic. So for them, books are projects. They're not, say, books. They're not marketing. They're not things that are done kind of as a collection of buildings and so forth. So, in terms of Frank Gehry, I know I have many books on him in my library, and I kept looking at them. Can this go in there? I have one on his houses. I have this houses chapter. Why not put that one in there? But it didn't work out, and I don't know if it has partly to do with he never wrote really any books on his own.
Well, this is what I'm wondering is one of the sort of overarching points of the book that for an architect to have influence, they kind of need to write, or is that not the point?
I wouldn't say it's the point, but when I think of some of the books that at least say in the monograph chapter, you know, there's one by Peter Rice that An Engineer Imagines, which is a beautiful book. But it came about because he was diagnosed with, I think it was cancer or a tumor or something, brain tumor, and wrote it at the end of his life. And, you know, it's visually a beautiful book, even though the visual end of it was done by his associates after his death. But there is very much an example of in this case, an engineer kind of getting out his ideas on paper.
Right. Yeah. Oh, and it's so important because Peter Rice worked with so many of the great architects, particularly the high-tech ones, and a lot of people don't understand how central he was to their creating their buildings, Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers and Norman Foster and all of those architects, which brings me to, I guess, another sort of point about kind of the overarching theme of the book. It does appear as if the books that you have selected generally fall into the category of either being, I guess, influencers in the story of 20th century modernism or reactions to it, but sort of, I guess, movement. There were certain movements that one would say have actually really been incredibly influential going into the 21st century, such as, I guess, deconstruction, you know, but you haven't spent much time with that particular movement. So is this ultimately a book about understanding the 20th century and modernism within it? I
think that it kind of ended up that way. And part of it might also be my education was in the 1990s. And, you know, deconstruction was, you know, kind of what I looked at when I was in studio, and could have very easily put something in. I was happy to see an old classmate of mine, Dwayne Euler, who practices there in LA, and he included folding in architecture as one of his books. But it was like when I looked at my criteria, folding in architecture really wouldn't work because it was put out as a periodical, and not as a you know, a statement, even though it was edited by Greg Lynn, you know, and kind of was a special issue. But anyways, I see that, you know, when it comes to computers and their impact on architecture, my book, you know, just kind of skirts or barely mentions that. So it certainly is omitting things that say are important now. So it's definitely not an exhaustive, you know, a final word on this.
Right.
And that's kind of why, like, it did seem in the process that things kind of fell into place, and, you know, the book kind of, you know, not wrote itself, but just kind of ended up like this for various reasons along the way.
So it's personal. It's but nonetheless, you're also making the argument that take all these books together and you get a sort of clear intellectual kind of lineage through the 20th century. But that lineage is generally coming from the European sort of architectural intelligentsia and the East Coast architectural intelligentsia. So sort of in the language of today, it's a Eurocentric idea of what matters. Is that right?
Yeah, I can't say I'm, like, you know, proud of that, because it does seem out of step in some ways. Like, is that what we really need, is another Eurocentric book on architecture? But it's part of it was focusing on English books that were either written in English or ones that were translated. there might be some books out of South America or China or wherever that haven't been translated or should be translated. And so, yeah, it did kind of end up in it, with my interests in modern architecture. There's certain places you have to start, with Gideon or with Corbusier, and then it kind of, once you do that, the others fall into place. So it definitely does what you're saying.
So one of the details that you include in most of your summaries, actually, as I recall, is the sales of the books, as in, or rather, let's say, public reception to the books. So that's pretty intriguing. Tell us about which ones did really well, which ones did really poorly, and is there a connection between the books that are highly influential, like The Guy You Can't Get Away From, Le Corbusier, and sales figures?
I think that the one book I indicate in the text that probably has sold the most is the Neufert book, because it's basically European graphic standards, and it's, I think, I can't remember the number right now. I could get out my book and look at it, but I think I say at least 400 or 500,000 copies of it have been sold. And as somebody who has published a few architecture books, that is massive. To get 5 figures in an architecture book is big. So to have 6 figures then is pretty incredible. I can't think of others. Shelter is another one in the housing chapter that has sold many, many copies. And that might be kind of an oddity compared to others, because it's not something you would see an architecture student looking at in class. It's kind of geared to people who own land, own homes, and want to do some DIY home building. And that's maybe why it's sold so much. But I can't think of others that say have not sold very well. And can you repeat the second part of your question?
Oh, is there a okay, so is there a connection between book sales and sort of influence in the realm of ideas? Like, did Vers une Architecture, was it a bestseller, or has it only ever sold to architecture students? While because I think you mentioned that you have Rudowski's Architecture Without Architects, and I think that did well as a book, but it hasn't been influential at all on architects. It's
Right.
kind of an annoyance to architects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that one's probably definitely sold more to people that are not architects. But in terms of influencing what architects do, it's certainly education and getting. I think the target for many publishers is to have books be part of syllabi, and learning from Las Vegas and books by Corbusier and so on. Banham, having those be just in history classes or whatever the class may be, but to have those be given every semester to a new crop of students, it kind of extends the influence of those. It's been a few years since I've taught, so can't really speak that all of these continue to be read in their entirety, but for sure they're at least touched upon in history classes.
Sure. And you mentioned Banham, who comes from the country that I come from, and did come in as an outsider and writes brilliantly, so you can't help sort of loving his writing, but he really did. You mentioned yourself, he overlooked sort of social and political issues, and he did big time. I mean, he completely I don't think even mentioned the Watts riots, which had happened 6 years before he arrived. He glorifies the freeways, glosses over the horrendous damage they caused to the communities that they're rammed through. Now, those kinds of ways of rereading kind of the cityscape have really come to the fore, if more even in the last 18 months since the murder of George Floyd than even before that was starting to happen. So do people like Reinier do they need, as one starts to kind of talk, these books recede into a past, does one have to kind of really sort of qualify what the attitudes of the time that they represented?
Perhaps, yeah. Although when you mention all that, I'll admit I finished my book in April 2020, the last day of April, and then George Floyd murder was what next month. And just when you write an architecture book, it's typically a 1-year turnaround for illustrated books. And in that year, so much was happening. And all I could think about with this book that is on its way through the stages of production was, this is very much this is not really relevant anymore. If I were making the book just in those few months later, if I were making it now, all those criteria I had would be different, and maybe the whole focus, or this would be more like, these are the seminal books. These are the ones that were important. But, when it would come time, maybe you have a book split into 2. There's those, but then here's kind of where things are heading now.
So then the question, and I'm going to go to an audience question after that, then the question becomes, should you have done a book, or should you have done an internet publication where you could go in and change up the copy to keep up with the moment?
Mm-hmm. If it was just personal, it would, I do a blog, I write online, but there's still, there's just something almost mental. There's something that it's, different in a book. There's something about the, you have a team of editors, you have designers, you have other people. So when you produce a book, the research, the, hopefully scholarship and all these other things make it into something different. So, I wouldn't want this to be necessarily just an online thing. But I know what you're saying. And there was another thought I had, but I'm kind of
and I should say, while you're thinking about your thought, I should say I was partly joking, because I know you love books. So that's what you wanted to do. But I'm just intrigued, because that's what these are the choices we confront today.
Yeah.
Which is,
and actually I just remembered, one thing I kind of come to or think about occasionally in terms of like books and say internet or digital, whatever you want to call it, is in terms of permanence, or in terms of it does seem like if you scan something now, you're making it more permanent than if it were just on a piece of paper. But I was on this cusp between the old and the new, the paper and digital in school. So by the time I graduated, AutoCAD, I had to take a class on AutoCAD in order to get a job. We didn't learn it in school, but I had to do a VOTEC class just so I could get a job after school. But anyways, so I documented everything with, put it on discs, and those discs are now obsolete, so I can't even get the stuff off those. But I don't have the things anymore because I documented them with photos that are on the disc. So it's like books kind of are often viewed as not, lasting as long as something that's on a server is being backed up and what have you. But there's no guarantee that those things on servers are going to be, have a longevity. And so I kind of like the idea of people producing books in order for those ideas to kind of continue to carry on. And I actually now, when I buy books, I tend to buy older ones because I just like getting those snapshots of time. Those aren't necessarily ones that were in here in Buildings and Print, but I just like the kind of getting, transported to those different times.
Sure. Now, there's one of your categories, monographs, that that one of our audience members has a question about, and I'm going to bring her in, Julie, our friend Julie Taylor. Julie, can you speak?
Yeah.
There we go.
I'm curious from both of you as writers and readers about the monograph. The classic architect's monograph was like a catalog. And then kind of in the way that video killed the radio star, it's like the, the internet kind of killed that catalog type of monograph. So where would you see the form going, going now to still be relevant?
I would hope that that architects, when they produce monographs, that they put more information into those than they do, say, on their websites or on sites like ArcDaily or what have you. And some architects I've seen doing that. I know Studio Gang's book, Reveal, I think it's maybe fitting that it was called that because it reveals a lot about their working process. I haven't seen their newest book by Phaidon, but I get the sense that it's not the same in that regard. It's maybe more toward kind of traditional monograph. But if I get monographs that are just loaded with photographs, and even if they're beautiful on large pages, and that, it's a little deflating, because I would love to just see more, learn more, and them take advantage of that setting to be able to say more.
Well, Julie, it's interesting you bring up monographs, because just in the last week, I heard that one of the really big publishing houses, the major New York publishing houses, has said they're not going to publish monographs at all going forward, architectural monographs. And even though we all know that architects were footing a good chunk of the bill for those monographs. So it may be that the market is kind of deciding it for us, but I would, and that maybe Instagram has just so much become the place where architects show their work, that it's really, is reducing in necessity. But I would ask you, because you're also an architecture journalist and historian, and you work with architects, helping them make those choices. Should they spend their money on making a $30,000 monograph, or that's probably low end price, but what do you think?
When I talk with my clients, my approach is that it's got to be about something, because if it's photo and this 4,000 square foot blah blah, that's boring also. So it's got to be under some other kind of theme, or do it in, it's got to be a different form, whether you're dialoguing about it or the text has to be different, but I believe it needs to be about something. So put the work in context.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's different from what John was saying, because John was saying the point of a monograph is to really, in very detailed way, simply show how the building's put together. And that's what those Wasmuth, if I'm saying it correctly, portfolios did. And that's how Europe got introduced to Frank Lloyd Wright, was through those really detailed monographs. But you're saying, Julie, that's boring. Needs to have a story attached, needs to have some theme. But then does that suggest that the point of the monograph today is to get to a wider public than, because a lot of the books that John was talking about are books that have influenced architects.
Right. I mean, if you're a known name, then yeah, people want to dive into those buildings. I always look at it as a marketing thing, right? So how are you going to get that out there, about if you're not known, then there's not the draw to get, okay, Frank Gehry's masterpieces or whatever. So what is it that you can impart about architecture or the world or what architects do in a thematic way that, yes, would have someone who doesn't know you be interested in the work.
Well, I think there was also an maybe inadvertent commentary on my part in the last book in the monograph chapter being not a current architect's monograph, but a group from the 1960s that is still kind of the go-to for experimental architecture when it, you know, comes up in exhibitions or comes up in the press or what have you. But to me, I have some books from Archigram that are the size of a postcard. And that seemed to be kind of how a lot of their work was published. But then this one is, you know, it's a good coffee table size. And so it's kind of maybe inadvertently expressing some hesitancy on, you know, what do architects now do? Or is it like, let's repackage what was done years ago because we know it's successful, but now we can make it even nicer, even better.
Mm. We're getting almost close to time now. We've just got about 5 more minutes, and so I wonder if anybody else has a question for John, or would David or Cello like to make a concluding point here? Wave if so, and we'll open the mic to you, and if not, I'll throw to Corinne.
Sure. No, I'll do a little bit of both. But I was maybe before we all spread out and to our 4 corners, since you had the opportunity to handle all of these books, were there any kind of standouts on, you know, a matching designer to the architecture, matching, you know, design and the tactility of these books, you know, because architecture can be interpreted through those designers as well. And were there any kind of standout examples that you want to just call out that we can?
Oh, those are hard. The ones that, well, what's coming to mind is just all the books put out by one publisher, and that's Lars Müller out of Switzerland, who did the Peter Zumthor book, but also he's done some reprints in recent years, such as a Siegfried Gideon book on housing from the 1920s, and Herzog and de Meuron catalog he did for the CCA. I think that was early 2000s. That has this embossed cover and different types of paper on the inside, and you know, it's just the bindings, you know, a lot of lay flat bindings, not necessarily in the case of the Herzog and de Meuron, but you know, just attention to detail. That is, I mean, it was hard for me to like at some point I realized there were a lot of books from MIT Press because they put out all these very influential academic books. But then Lars Müller, there were a lot from him because he put out these just kind of beautiful visual books, and not that they're not academic or scholarly occasionally or in their own right, but I had to like hesitate. I have a Wang Shu one that he did that has these fold out drawings, and it has this kind of Japanese stitching, exposed stitching, and it's like I just have to stop because otherwise it's just going to be a book about what they're doing. So those are what come to mind right now.
Beautiful. And I'll just also do a little brief commercial. You know, thank you so much for everyone being virtual, but we're open. I'd love to invite you to our museum in person. And I'm actually in the context of one of our amazing galleries, McSpontley, Contemporary Echoes. And it's just so important to see things in real life. And I hope you come out, and I hope we do more of these. And thank you all to AIA as well. Corinne, do you want to close it out?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone. Just looking forward to having future events with LACMA, but really thank you to John and Francis for putting this together, but also to our wonderful Interiors Committee, my favorite committee at AIALA. I shouldn't have favorites, but I do. But yes, you know, stay in touch, get onto our newsletter. And one thing that we did at the beginning of the pandemic is we ask everyone to unmute themselves and to give a round of applause. And since we're almost through January, you guys, we're almost going to be back in person. So I encourage you all to unmute yourself right now and give everyone a round of applause for being here. Thank you so much.